Good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Campbell. I'm the director of the Fine Art Museums, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this morning for the public opening and celebration of our newest exhibition, The Tudors, Art and Majesty in Renaissance England. Organized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this exhibition is the first major exhibition in the United States to explore the portraiture and decorative arts of the renowned Tudor courts and how these fascinating monarchs, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, used art to establish their power and legitimize their reigns. As the sole West Coast venue for the exhibition, we're delighted to have the opportunity to present the lavish artistry of the Tudor era here at the Legion of Honor in the context of our wider European collections. In addition to the splendor of the objects, the armors, the paintings, the jewelry, and so on in the galleries, the ground floor galleries here, I want to also make sure that you know that upstairs at the end of our Renaissance medieval corridor in Gallery 1, we have part of the exhibition featuring spectacular tapestries from Henry VIII's collection is also included in the exhibition. So do please make sure you get up there. These tapestries are absolutely spectacular, and I feel a special personal link with them because, as one or two of you may know, before I became a museum director, I was a tapestry historian. And I actually wrote a book about Henry VIII's tapestry collection. So they're pieces that I either identified or was involved in identifying, so it feels very personal. In today's program, we will hear from the exhibition's organizing curators, Adam Coecke, Associate Curator of European Paintings, and Elizabeth Cleland, Curator of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, both at the Met Museum in New York. I want to thank Adam and Lizzie for producing such an extraordinary, rich show, synthesizing so much research and bringing in their own insights to this fabulous statement about art at the Tudor courts. And I want to thank them for so graciously working with our own team and, of course, coming out here for this opening event. Their presentation will be followed by a conversation with Martin Chapman, our curator in charge of European decorative arts and sculpture, who is the coordinating curator for the exhibition here at the Legion, along with Thomas Wu, former assistant curator of European decorative arts and sculpture. Lastly, I want to thank you, our wonderful visitors, whether this is your first time at the Legion or your 50th. We couldn't do any of this without your support. And I'd like to remind you that general admissions and general programming at the Legion and at the De Young is free every Saturday, thanks to the support of our Chair Emeritus, Mrs. Wilsey. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth Cleland. Lizzie studied at the Courtauld Institute in London, where she wrote a PhD thesis about medieval tapestries. She joined the Metropolitan, Lizzie, how many years ago? 19 years ago, how time flies, where she's had a distinguished career as a curator of textiles in the European Decorative Arts Department and has organized a number of large and small exhibitions, including an amazing monographic exhibition on the great 16th century tapestry designer Pieter van Aelst back in 2014. But now to talk to us about her latest exhibition, Lizzie, your floor.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. It's really such a pleasure and an honor to be here in San Francisco, and very, very grateful for the invitation to talk to you today. So, from 1485 until 1603, a Welsh family, the Tudors, held the English throne. It was just 118 years, and 5 monarchs spread over only 3 generations. And throughout those 118 years, in the opinion of many of their contemporaries, both at home and abroad, the Tudors really didn't have much of a true claim to that throne of England. The first monarch, Henry Tudor, had claimed it on the grounds that through his mother, his great-great-great-grandfather was King Edward III, but through an illegitimate bloodline. And yet, despite those challenges, I think you'd probably agree that even now, 500 years later, the Tudors remain one of the most famous British royal dynasties. And certainly 2 of them, the second Tudor monarch, King Henry VIII, and his daughter, the last Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, are still synonymous with notions of royal majesty. So why is that? Well, I think it's more than just the tabloid-worthy shenanigans of their personal lives. After all, their French contemporaries, the Valois, were even more outrageous. And certainly we would argue here that it was because of their incredibly canny use of art patronage. Through the art that they bought and commissioned and surrounded themselves with, they were able to craft a narrative of legitimacy, to create a court so splendid that people just couldn't call into question the fact that they were to the court born, to the crown born. And certainly when Adam Meeker and I decided to grapple with the notion of the Tudors, this was the aspect we really wanted to embrace, their art patronage. This is really a show about art history. As you've heard, Adam is a curator in European paintings, and I'm a curator in decorative arts. And what we wanted to do, working on the show, which is upwards of 7 years now as the project's lasted, was really pool our curatorial areas of specialization. Of course, those marvelous and evocative paintings, especially the portraits, and Adam's going to talk to you about those in more detail in just a few moments, but set them within the context of all the other art forms that the Tudors loved and spent massive amounts of money on. The splendid textiles, the manuscripts, the arms and armor, the sculpture. And really have them shown together, side by side, in dialogue with each other. In New York, we opted to present these works thematically, and I'm just showing you here a few slides to give you a sense of what the show looked like back at the Met. Here, for example, you'll recognize those monumental bronzes by Benedetto da Rovezzano, the candelabrum and the angels, and behind them that Florentine velvet cloth of gold ornamented with what would become known as the Tudor Rose. Lots of lovely English silversmiths' work, but containing vessels of Chinese porcelain, Indian mother of pearl, or the French furniture, and behind them, the Flemish tapestries. Or here, Henry VIII's wonderful luxury printed books, the Astronomicum Caesarium, and behind it you can see on the back wall there that glorious portrait of Elizabeth from Hardwicke Hall. So one of the pleasures of collaborating with other institutions is that our show has not frozen or atrophied. It's really continued to grow and develop, and that's why we're very excited to encounter here the quite different show that you have here in San Francisco. It's very stimulating for us to see how the material is shared with you here on the West Coast. Along the way, what we really wanted to do was grapple with some old stereotypes, set the record straight, and encourage people to think about the Tudors in perhaps different ways to what they might have thought before. One of those big old chestnuts is that somehow Tudor England was a little bit of an artistic backwater, sort of struggling to keep up and slightly behind what was happening in the rest of Europe with the Valois in France or the Habsburgs or the Medici. And as I hope you'll agree when you walk through the galleries, nothing could be further from the truth. One of the great things about all 5 of the Tudor monarchs is that they had the good taste and the money to buy and commission the very best that certainly Europe and in some cases the world had to offer. I mentioned the Chinese porcelain, the Indian mother of pearl, in terms of raw materials, Burmese rubies, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. In terms of technique, we have damascening of precious metals, and also finished artworks. And you can see here on the slide on the left a detail of an absolutely gorgeous Flemish tapestry, which is upstairs, designed in Antwerp, woven in Brussels, and in also many cases under some, not all of the Tudors, England also proved to be a bit of a safe haven, a place of refuge for European artists undergoing religious persecution. But alongside bringing all this great art in, they also set it with areas where England had a traditional area of expertise, a recognized high level within the world artistic community, things like silversmithing, or as you can see here, the detail on the right is this fragment of needlework, gold and black work embroidery. It's in the show, do look for it. It's very small, but it's a lovely surviving example of the highest quality of decorated linens for shirts or for sleeves or for the palatial quality household linens. It was also a center of the most cutting-edge artistic design. And so you can see here a detail of Pietro Torrigiano's terracotta bust of John Fisher. Torrigiano had come to London from Florence. John Fisher, the city you can see here, is the last Cardinal of England who subsequently would be imprisoned and eventually beheaded at the order of Henry VIII. And again, I can't resist reminding you of these incredible monumental bronzes by Benedetto da Rovezzano, another Florentine sculptor. These are the bronzes that Henry VIII eventually appropriated for his own tomb, although they were never used in the end. Contemporaries describe them as curiously graven, and you can see that detail there of what they meant. But it's not just the cutting-edge design, but also the innovation of the technique that we can appreciate this massive-scale bronze casting taking place in London. Another of those stereotypes we'd love to grapple with, this notion that the first Tudor, Henry VII, he claimed the throne as Henry Tudor, as I said, on the grounds of his great-great-great-grandfather. He wasn't, as has so often been suggested, some sort of frugal miser. That's a notion of grown up in posterity. But at the time, he's really the first one of the family to really realize the worth of using art to service that narrative of legitimacy. So he spends prudently but prodigiously, and you can really get a sense of that again up in gallery number 1, where you can see this tapestry, the creation on view, absolutely heavy with gold and silver precious metal wrapped threads. And remember, this wasn't just the one tapestry. That tapestry is from a set of 10 that size, and that set of 10 was just one of many, many glorious monumental scale tapestry sets that he acquired from Flanders and brought over to England to create this setting truly worthy of a king. Or the incredible cope lent to us from the Jesuits in Britain, often traditionally known as the Stonyhurst cope. And you can see a nice overall view and then a rather horrible close-up that I took myself. But that is a reminder for you to really lean in close and look at it, and you will appreciate there are at least 4 different types of gold and silver, metal wrapped thread, metal drawn thread, used to glorious effect in this cope, this vestment made for the priest to wear whilst he was taking church services. Remember, this was from a set of more than 30 such such priestly vestments that Henry VII commissioned for the priest and the monks of Westminster Abbey to wear. He commissions it from velvet weavers working in Tuscany, simultaneously in Florence and in Lucca, because they were again considered at the absolute top of their profession. It's got this gorgeous, deep crimson velvet pile, all this glittering gold in different effects. And you can imagine how the priests and the monks walking around the east end of Westminster Abbey were literally encased with the Tudor family symbols and heraldic elements. Looking at those raw materials, knowing they were commissioned from so far away, the number of pieces, it perhaps won't surprise you to know that Henry VII paid as much as £100,000, that's an estimate based on the documents, for that one set of vestments. And that was just one of many such commissions over the years of his reign. Or his granddaughter, Queen Mary I, not just the cartoon character villain, Bloody Mary, but also, remember, the first uncontested female monarch in England. That's an incredible feat, remembering that in much of Europe at this time, it was actually illegal for a woman to hold the throne. So facing so much prejudice against her reign, she really followed the example of her grandfather, Henry VII, to use art to create the most splendid of European royal courts. She was helped by her Habsburg husband, Prince Philip, the future Philip II of Spain, to bring the most admired and virtuoso European artists to London. People like the Neapolitan medalist Jacopo d'Atrezzo, who created this extraordinary gold portrait medal celebrating Mary's coming to the throne. And you can see that upstairs, right here in the exhibition as well. And then the final Tudor, Mary's half-sister, Queen Elizabeth I, extraordinary 45-year-long reign, not just England's second female sovereign, but also single and unmarried, realizing that her subjects were no longer allowed to venerate the Virgin Mary. Instead, she gives them herself to devote and praise, the Virgin Queen, and the country, like their Virgin Queen, remaining impenetrable, contained, safely battened against onslaughts from Europe and the rest of the world, a bit like the battened down Noah's Ark, which you can see here on the extraordinary Heneage jewel, safely riding out those stormy waters of the rest of Europe and the world. And if you open, oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. My great reveal. Let's see, we go here. Oops.
That's it.
Yeah. So I think we want to go to open. Is it on the desktop?
Oh, Rich can help.
Thank you. Tension mounts. And it's up a bit. This one. Lovely, thank you. There we are. If we open that jewel, this is what we see. It was worth the wait. So, Elizabeth, through pageantry, poetry, portraiture, in textiles like this one, but above all in paintings, she manages to craft this near-mythical identity, which certainly held sway over her own subjects, and in many cases actually earned the respect of her contemporaries overseas as well. And I would argue still remains with us today when you walk through the exhibition galleries, especially those great culminating spaces where we can see Elizabeth, the mythical Virgin Queen of England. But at this, I'm going to stop talking and hand over to my excellent colleague, Adam, to talk to you a bit more about the portraits. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lizzie, and thank you so much to Tom and Martin and Thomas for joining us for this presentation today. Thank you to everyone here at the museum who has made this final leg of our show possible. It's really such a pleasure to be back in this beautiful city and this beautiful museum. Lizzie has given you an overview of our exhibition and some of the key themes, as well as the history of the Tudor dynasty. And I wanted to focus on one particular aspect of the show, which is the power of portraiture. As Lizzie has already indicated, one of the reasons why we remember the Tudors the way that we do is not just their exploits, their misdeeds, their scandalous lives, but also the incredible portraits that were painted of them, of their courtiers, of other members of society. They had the great good fortune to employ at the court of Henry VIII, one of the greatest portraitists of art history, Hans Holbein the Younger. You see his portrait of the future Edward VI here on the screen. And Holbein crafted a truly indelible image of these monarchs and was then succeeded by several generations of very gifted portraitists who allow us to feel that we know these figures in a way that is an artistic fiction, but an incredibly compelling one nonetheless. One thing to keep in mind about portraiture in Tudor society is that it did not primarily have an aesthetic function. We go to a museum like this one today to admire portraits from the past as works of artistry, as beautiful objects. But in the Tudor period, they had very distinct social functions, and I'm going to walk you through a few of those functions today through the example of some of the great portraits in this exhibition. My personal favorite is probably the one you see on the screen behind me. It's Hans Uwerth's portrait of Mary Neville, Lady Dacre. Hans Uwerth was a Flemish émigré, one of these European artists whom Lizzie has already mentioned, who sought refuge as Protestants in England. And he depicted this formidable matriarch, Mary Neville, Lady Dacre, as a commemoration for a 20-year campaign that she waged to restore her family's lands and titles. Mary Neville was a courtier. She and her husband served the court of Henry VIII. They were in fact dispatched when his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, arrived in England to help carry the canopy above her head. But they had a dramatic fall from grace when Lord Dacre was involved in a poaching raid against a neighboring nobleman, a poaching raid during which a gameskeeper was killed. This was considered to be a major disgrace, and he was stripped of his titles, his lands. He was executed as a common criminal. And Mary Neville, who had been left relatively penniless, the mother of a very young son, she spent the next 20 years campaigning to have this legal decision against her late husband reversed. And this portrait commemorates that campaign. You see her actually in the act of drafting a petition to the court to restore her son's rights and titles. In the background, you have a portrait of her late husband, and it's a wonderful bit of information for us of how portraits were displayed in the Tudor period in a very austere wooden frame, hung directly with laces against a tapestry. And when we were conceiving our exhibition, I tried my best to convince Lizzie, my tapestry colleague, to let us reproduce this effect, but it didn't quite pass modern conservation standards. Nonetheless, this portrait really inspired us in our design for the exhibition, where we wanted to have precisely these effects of layering and overlapping between different media. You have painting here, but also tapestry, other textiles. You have the wonderful blackwork embroidery of Lady Dacre's collar. You have the objects of metalwork on her desk. And all of this combines with various layers of disguised symbolism to give us an extremely powerful portrait of this woman and her determination. She was ultimately successful in the early years of the reign of Elizabeth. The family's lands and titles were restored to her son. And a second portrait was painted now in the National Portrait Gallery in London that shows them united together, mother and son, in the most sumptuous attire that you can imagine. Portraiture had a key dynastic function. It secured lines of succession. And as you may already know, Henry VIII was obsessed with securing his own succession. The Tudor dynasty was considered by many to be illegitimate, and he was really driven to the brink of despair by the fact that his first two wives did not give birth to sons. This led him to break with the Roman Catholic Church, to plunge England into crisis. It's only in his third marriage to Jane Seymour that he finally has a male heir, the future Edward VI. And that birth was commemorated in this portrait by Hans Holbein that depicts this chubby young prince, very much a future king, making a regal gesture. He's holding a rattle that looks like a scepter. And one of the things that's very interesting about this portrait is that it was Holbein's personal gift to the king at New Year. One of the main rituals of the Tudor courts was the exchange of gifts between monarch and subject at New Year, and artists in particular would strive to catch the monarch's eye by making ingenious gifts. So Holbein knew exactly how to flatter Henry by depicting his young son. He collaborated with a humanist poet to come up with this lengthy Latin inscription, which is addressed directly to the prince and exhorts him to emulate his father, saying that he could have no better role model as a monarch. At the Tudor courts, there was no such thing as too much flattery. They didn't really have the concept of overdoing it in that regard. And one thing that's quite interesting about this painting is that the inscription is signed by the poet, Richard Morrison, but Holbein's signature is nowhere to be found. And in fact, if you looked at the two surviving inventories of Henry VIII's possessions, you wouldn't find the name of a single painter. That was not actually considered to be a factor in the value of a work of art, quite astonishing for us to wrap our heads around today. But painting really was a practical object. Painters were considered to be craftspeople, and very often the value of a painting was much more tied to its materials than to who painted it. In this case, I would like to just point out this rather dingy gray background of the portrait. That background back in the 16th century would have been a brilliant blue. Holbein used a pigment made from ground glass called smalt that would have been very bright and engaging at the time, but over the centuries it's discolored. It was actually one of the cheaper blue pigments Holbein could have used, as opposed to, say, ultramarine, which would have been imported from Afghanistan. But Holbein had to use that pigment because he paid for the materials of this portrait himself. This was his personal gift. So paintings are not just records of how people looked, but please bear in mind they're physical objects. They change over time, and they are made from materials that could have been gathered from all over the world. Edward VI, as you'll learn in the exhibition, had a very short reign. He died as a teenager of tuberculosis, was succeeded, as Lizzie has already recounted, by Mary, the first woman to reign England in her own right. And then after her brief and controversial reign, we come to Elizabeth. And we're very privileged in this exhibition to have a wonderful loan from a private collection of the earliest life-size, full-length portrait of Elizabeth. She's shown here at a moment before her iconography as the Virgin Queen had really solidified. Instead, this is most likely a portrait that would have played a role, as so many portraits did, in marriage negotiations, dispatched to a European court to give a sense of how this young queen looked, to impress her potential suitor with both her beauty but also her power and her wealth. She appears resting her hand on the finial of a throne, standing before an armorial tapestry or hanging, and all of the symbolism in this portrait is about fertility, love, youth, and beauty. She's holding a flower known as a pink or a carnation. It's a symbol of marital love. And then the background opens up into this vision of fertility and abundance with flowers and fruits tumbling forward. One of the things that's very interesting about this portrait is that it was recently the object of extensive study at Yale, and the conservators and curators there were able to make a very persuasive attribution of it to George Gower, who is one of the very first native-born English painters that we know of. Prior to this point, the portraitists who succeeded at court were mostly from the Netherlands, from the German-speaking lands like Hans Holbein or Hans Ewirth. Gower is an artist, though, born in England, and you see a very different style of painting here, relatively flat, very much about the delight of a decorative surface and the meticulous reproduction of textiles. When we were devising the exhibition, it was very important to us that we didn't just want portraits of the 5 Tudor monarchs or the leading noblemen and noblewomen of the court. We wanted also to focus on the people who actually made the creation of this art possible, whether it was the artists themselves or the many merchants, the middlemen and women who brokered deals across Europe, who supplied the materials, who arranged for commissions. And one of the loans from the Metropolitan's permanent collection to the show is this wonderful and very small portrait of an unidentified man in royal livery. Livery is a kind of uniform that you wore when you served the court. It was actually part of your salary, an important part of your salary at a time when clothing was incredibly expensive. And we know this is livery because we can actually see the king's initials, HR, embroidered on either side of this man's jacket. We don't know who he was, but we think that this is probably a colleague of Holbein's, someone who wouldn't have been a titled courtier, but someone who worked perhaps as a clerk, perhaps even as a painter, according to some theories. And it's also a very intimate image. It's one you'll see in the exhibition that you could hold in your hand. This is a moment when the miniature portrait emerges as very intimate objects. Originally, this would have had a lid, keeping it in its excellent condition that we see today. So it's an interactive object. It doesn't hang on the wall, but you take it up in your hands, you uncover it, and then you would contemplate this man's image, enacting whatever relationship of friendship or family that you had to him. And he stands in this show for all of those people who made the splendor of the Tudor courts possible, but whose names we may not be able to record today. Finally, a key theme of the show is the globalization of Tudor art. The materials in the show came from all over Europe, Africa, Asia, even the Americas. You'll see Burmese rubies, you'll see Indian mother of pearl, ultramarine pigment from Afghanistan. But we also have a traveler to England, the Moroccan ambassador, Abd al-Wahid bin Masoud bin Mohammed Anuri, who came to England in 1600 as part of what was ostensibly a trade delegation from the Sultan of Morocco to Elizabeth's court. The English were huge consumers of Moroccan sugar, but in fact, he came with clandestine orders to propose an Anglo-Moroccan military alliance against their shared enemy of Spain. He stayed at court for 6 months. Nothing came of this military proposal, but he and his entourage were figures of fascination. They attended all of the key rituals of court. We have a wonderful record of how Elizabeth ordered a group of tapestries to be brought to Hampton Court to furnish her audience chamber when she received him wearing her very best jewels. And he also sat for this portrait, which is believed to be the very first portrait painted of a Muslim in England. And it comes to us as a loan from the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham. It's there because there's a theory among some scholars of English literature that this embassy actually inspired Shakespeare to write his play Othello. Not everyone subscribes to that theory. It may be a bit fanciful, but certainly it speaks to the flourishing of artistic and literary culture at the end of the Tudor period, as well as the ever-increasing global connections of the time. So with that, I will hand things back to Martin, and very much looking forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. That was really great. And thank you both for giving these observations about the exhibition. So now we'll have a brief hiatus while we arrange the chairs so that we can have a Q&A with Adam and Lizzie. So if you just bear with us for a few moments while we get set up, we will then start the next part of this. So is this going to work? Seems to be on. Hello? No? Don't think it's on. Lights on. Try pressing that. Hello? No. Well, I'll try projecting my voice for the moment. I think you can all hear me, can you? Yeah. Good. So let's, can I start off by asking Lizzie if a question about really the accessibility of the works of art. So today, in the 21st century, we're used to being able to see works of art in museums and galleries. But in the 16th century, who would have been able to view these wonderful works of art that we see in this exhibition?
Well, thanks so much for that excellent question, Martin and Thomas. I think certainly it's a bit of a harsh reminder that back in the 16th century, the opinion of many people like us probably wouldn't have counted for much. We were not the targeted audience for a lot of the artwork that you will see in the show today. We chose to focus very much on art made for the court. There are so many fascinating stories we could have shared about Tudor England, development of England as a society in the 16th century, but we opted to really focus in on the court context, and certainly to a large extent, the key audience for those works would be the courtiers, the English nobles, and also the visiting ambassadors from the rest of Europe and from the world, as we saw that magnificent portrait of the Moroccan ambassador. That said, there are some inklings of what would have filtered through to the general populace. And for example, I showed that lovely, incredible gold portrait medal by Jacopo d'Atrezzo of Mary. Though very few people would have been privileged enough to have looked at that gold medal or other casts of it. In fact, Jacopo's design was used as the design for the shilling coin. Simplified, obviously, only cast in base metal for use as coinage for the general populace, but they would have seen that the ghost of that wonderful image of Mary. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
One of the really fascinating things, if you read ambassadors' accounts of visiting the Tudor palaces, is that access to art was a very explicit form of privilege that was doled out to a special few. So if you came to visit Elizabeth and you were coming from a very important monarch, you might be ushered into what was called her closet, her privy chamber, the most private part of the palace. And there she herself would open up the cabinet and undo the wrappings of her collection of miniature portraits and hand them to you. So the encounter with art was a way of bestowing favor. It was a very intimate act, and it was a physical act. Unfortunately, you won't be able to handle the portrait miniatures yourself when you visit the exhibition, but that tactility was very much part of the interaction with them in the 16th century.
Thank you. Thomas.
Yes, and our next question for you is, throughout the Tudor period, we see continental influence on artistic production for the English court. But did England influence continental art during the 16th century? And were there media or techniques at which English artists or craftspeople particularly excelled?
Well, I think so I could jump in there because it tends to be more on the decorative arts side of things. Certainly, needlework was one area where the English could claim to fame for at least the preceding 2 centuries. In fact, the type of needlework called opus anglicanum, literally translating as English work, was sought after throughout Western Europe, certainly for the preceding 2 centuries. And that's still something that they excelled in, like that lovely fragment of the blackwork embroidery you can see in the show. The other area I would single out is silversmithing. Although you had great goldsmiths and silversmiths throughout Western Europe at this period, the English really excelled in the marketing of it, and we have accounts of merchants coming from Venice who were overwhelmed by the sight of so many silversmiths' shops in rows in the Cheapside area of London, and others who would go to dinner parties with the sort of the moneyed professional classes, the doctors, the lawyers, the merchants, and again would say they haven't seen displays of silver like this in all their experience in Florence, in Rome, in Venice.
Thank you very much.
So, while there are clear differences between the art of Henry VII's and Elizabeth's long reigns, is that going to work better, do you think? Let's try. Can you hear me? Good. Do you see any notable differences or similarities between the art produced during Edward VI and Mary's much shorter reigns, considering their opposing religious affiliations?
Well, one of the key artistic developments of Edward's reign is actually a negative one. It's his short reign that really sees widespread iconoclasm throughout England. There is a wholesale destruction of altarpieces, religious statues. One of the reasons why we have so little medieval English devotional sculpture, for example, or so few surviving altarpieces, is the literal breaking and smashing of them under Edward. And for Mary, there is a huge project then of restoration and reparation, and she very much wants to bring England back into the continental fold. And so she is a very sophisticated consumer of images. And she also is really savvy in the way that she uses jewelry, textiles to proclaim her legitimacy. When you look at her portraiture, you see the same jewels repeated over and over again. Those might include, for example, a reliquary containing a fragment of the True Cross that she ordered repaired and then wore on her body in all of her portraits. So she very much sees herself as undoing the damage to the physical fabric of Catholicism that has been wrought by her half-brother.
So as a quick follow-up then, under Elizabeth, did it reverse again? Did we find more iconoclasm as a result of the shifts?
One of the things that I personally find very appealing about Elizabeth is that she seems to have been very pragmatic and very moderate, at least by comparison with her siblings. She was herself a Protestant, but she famously said that she did not endeavor to make windows into men's souls. She wanted people to conform. She wanted the state to be secure. She certainly persecuted people. I don't want to sugarcoat the presentation, but it wasn't that kind of orthodox, dogmatic destruction that you saw in various forms of both objects and of people's lives under her half-siblings.
Thank you.
And our next question is closely related. While the English Reformation affected religious art within the context of churches, did it influence more secular forms of art produced for the court, like portraiture and luxury goods? was there a difference between luxury goods produced for a Catholic versus a Protestant court?
Maybe if I could jump in there, I would say one very happy consequence of England's embrace of the Reformation was that it became such a haven for many European artisans, particularly practitioners of stained glass, for example, coming over to England to flee from the religious persecution they were encountering in Flanders especially. And so what we see is this burgeoning of the production of stained glass, also Flemish tapestry weavers coming over, settling in London. Actually, interestingly enough, many of these European artisans settled in Southwark, which those of you who know London is just south of the river near Southwark Cathedral, which meant they were just outside the guild boundaries of the city of London, and therefore they were able to operate not following all the rules and constraints of the established craft guilds within London. But we see a great burgeoning of very high quality and cutting edge design, stained glass, textiles and so forth, and again, silversmithing, making those areas available to the court. And certainly we have people like Bernard Flowers, which was an anglicization of a Flemish stained glass artist, but also in addition to making their work available to the court, also to that wealthy, professional sort of middle class of consumers in England. So a very rich period from that perspective.
Thank you very much.
So, Adam, did you make any surprising discoveries when researching for this exhibition?
Thanks. Well, there were many moments when we were able, as Lizzie said in her remarks, to work against certain stereotypes or myths about the Tudor court. One that I was particularly satisfied about was there's a portrait of Henry VIII's first son, his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, and it's a very striking portrait because he's shown in his nightcap and his undershirt. You see his bare chest. He died as a teenager, again, of consumption, as so many people did. And the line about this portrait had always been, he's shown as an invalid. That's why he's depicted in this very unusual way. And that didn't really make sense to me. He was Henry's only viable heir at the time he was portrayed. I didn't know why you would memorialize him as someone frail or sickly. And when I went back to the period sources, it turns out that his illness came on in the last 3 weeks of his life. So unless that portrait was painted 3 weeks before he died, it doesn't make sense at all that he was an invalid. But actually, what I discovered is that it shows him on his wedding night. He is a bridegroom. It's a commemoration of his marriage, and it's actually supposed to be a sexy image. So I felt that was a very sort of interesting shift in our perception of this portrait.
Fascinating. Lizzie, have you got had any discoveries?
Yes, I'd say not quite as exciting as that one, but a bit more of a sort of textile nerd one, actually. You will encounter in the show that absolutely gorgeous, very large expanse of the Florentine cloth of gold velvet. It's intact. That's not a collage. That's 3 full loom widths wide and 3 repeats of the pattern tall. It's a velvet wall hanging, and this is the type of work that we know Henry VII spent lots and lots of money on, bringing masses of examples of this over to London from Florence. And one of the fascinating details, if you look closely at that velvet, is you will discover the very distinctive and recognizable Tudor rose, the 5 petals, the bi-colored with the red center and the white, or in this case gold, outer petals. And for a long time people have looked at an example like that, I should say it's from the Met's collection, and said, oh well, it must have been a special commission by Henry VII to customize the design to include the family's Tudor rose, celebrating Henry's role combining the 2 previously warring houses of York and Lancaster. But the fly in the ointment is that in fact that design already exists in cloth of gold velvets still in Florence, which were already installed in 1475. So 10 years before Henry claims the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And it was only really going back to the documents and realizing, looking at the work of other scholars, people like Lisa Monas, who focus on velvets, realizing that Henry surrounded himself with these velvets that I thought, well, perhaps that's actually what gave him the idea to develop the Tudor rose as his personal symbol. He saw that motif on these velvets. Originally it's just included as a sort of Marian device celebrating the Virgin Mary as the rose of God. But he takes it on to become what would eventually be this worldwide recognizable symbol, the Tudor rose. So, as I say, a bit of a textile nerd.
No, it's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. The chicken or the egg question. Thomas, you've got it.
Yes, and perhaps, yes, one more question before we turn to the audience. Is there one work of art in the exhibition that each of you found most interesting or compelling? And could you please tell us a bit more about it?
Well, I think I've already shown my favorite, which is Lady Dacre. I can't get enough of her, and the portrait in the background, the story, the way it evokes for us the display of Tudor art. And I was so thrilled that the National Gallery of Canada was willing to lend that portrait to all three venues, because I think the fact that it's been in Ottawa since, I believe, the 1930s has meant that it hasn't really been incorporated into the story of Tudor art. But to me, it's an absolutely iconic painting, and one that tells just the story of the power of Tudor portraiture better than almost any other.
For me, I'm afraid I'm very fickle, Thomas. Every time I'm asked that question, I name a different work. And I would challenge everyone here, if you go and see the show, and remember to go upstairs as well, you'll probably find the same. Every piece you look at, you think, well, this is really the star of the show, and then you go on and see something else, which is equally as exciting. Of course, the tapestries. That said, and you might have picked that up again in my presentation, overall, I think the thing I was most excited to be able to include in the exhibition is that extraordinary bronze candelabrum by Benedetto da Rovezzano, because it embodies so much of what we were trying to prove of how England was this magnet attracting these great artists to come and set up shop, because they realized there was this money and this enthusiasm amongst the Tudor monarchs and their courtiers for commissioning this very cutting-edge design. But also, again, that was a very generous loan from Ghent Cathedral in Flanders in Belgium. The long and complicated story, in a few sentences, the Benedetto's bronzes and the three pieces you see upstairs are reunited for the first time in almost 400 years. They had been knocking around Windsor. They were never actually used in the end for Henry VIII's tomb. When England has its, or Britain by that point, has its short-lived republic under Oliver Cromwell, there's the Commonwealth sales in 1649. All the bronzes are sold off, and the four large candelabrum are bought by the Bishop of Ghent, who immediately ships them across the channel to Flanders. They were set up in front of the main altar in Ghent Cathedral, and they've remained there ever since. So it was with great trepidation that I approached the canon and the chapter of Ghent to ask if there was any way they might consider lending one of the candelabra to the show, and absolutely thrilled when they agreed to be without it for the year of the run of the exhibition. And then the excitement of commissioning the survey to see if it was even possible to bring one of these massive bronze elements across the Atlantic, which is when we really understood for the first time that it's made up of 10 components, a central shaft, and then 9 cylinders which stack up and around it to create this extraordinary whole. So it's a very, very exciting moment to be able to share a work like that with so many visitors and people interested in the Tudors. And again, something in the cathedral which perhaps hasn't been included in the general Tudor artistic literature as much as maybe it should have been in the past.
Thank you very much, Lizzie and Adam.
Well, now it would be an opportunity for people in the audience to ask panel questions. Are there any questions? We'll come with a microphone to you somehow.
Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. I love what you've had to say about these surprises to you. But this question falls on about what you were just talking about in terms of the complexities of an exhibit just in general, and further a traveling exhibit. I'm fascinated. I've read the book. that accompany this. Wonderful. I'm really interested in the complexities of designing an exhibit in one place, moving it to the next place and the next place, and how certain items show up in some exhibits and not others. Can you talk a little bit about how that's decided, managed, and all of those challenges around when you can have things in one place and not another, and sending them back to their original origination points?
Sure, it's a great question. And one of the joys, I think, for both Lizzie and me of this show has been to see how different curatorial teams in Cleveland and in San Francisco, working with their designers, have come up with very different visual presentations and conceptions. But with regard to the specifics of objects and their fragility, one of the major difficulties is particularly light-sensitive works, the miniature portraits, drawings, some of the textiles, and conservators, God bless them, have very strict rules to protect these objects and keep them looking as wonderful as they do. So for example, the Holbein miniatures from the Met's own collections will need to rest in total darkness for 10 years after this exhibition. That's the prescription of our conservation team. And so we really, of course, want these to live for another 500 years or longer, be accessible to audiences. And so that's one reason why there are different formulations of the show at each venue. But we've been so thrilled to see the additions that have come to the show here in San Francisco from places like the Berger Collection in Denver that really amplify the exhibition.
In the exhibition, there's a description that says, after the establishment of the Church of England, many Catholic arts, especially the saints' portraiture, were destroyed. Could you give more detail about this?
Do you want me to jump in there? Yes, indeed, great question. And we could spend the next 5 days engaging with that. And that, indeed, we could have done an exhibition just about the context of the iconoclasm in England. But certainly, in a nutshell, as Adam so beautifully synthesized in his presentation, it's really the second Tudor monarch, Henry VIII, who sets England on a path of breaking with the Roman Catholic Church. In part, it's a build-up of frustration with the authority of the Vatican over the English monarch, which Henry characteristically bridled against. There was also the aspect that the Roman Catholic Church was allowed to tax the English populace outside the state taxes. But then it really comes to a head when the Pope refuses to grant Henry VIII his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So Henry breaks from the Roman Catholic Church. He regards the Pope not as his superior, but simply as the Bishop of Rome. But I think it's important to remember that he doesn't actually become a Protestant. He's still a good Catholic, just not a Roman Catholic. And he has himself named as the supreme head of the Catholic Church of England. And it's only after Henry dies in 1547 and his young son Edward comes to the throne as King Edward VI that is then when once and for all England breaks with the Roman Catholic Church, with the Catholic Church, and becomes a Protestant nation. Edward's very much under the influence of his Seymour uncles, who were Protestants. And one of his first acts is to pass what was called the Act of Uniformity, which was the creation of an English language book of common prayer and a new liturgy, which kept some aspects of the Catholic practice, but changed a lot as well. And it's really under Edward that he sends out his agents throughout England to destroy, to practice the iconoclasm, again with a series of acts to destroy any sort of Catholic devotional art.
If you're interested in this topic, there's a very good book called The Breaking of the Altars that really gives extensive detail about the destruction that occurred.
Yeah, Eamon Duffy? Yeah, the stripping of the altars.
Stripping of the altars, excuse me.
Roger.
Hi. Just quickly. So it's clear that only the nobles or the royal family could wear certain clothing, and that was really clear, has always been clear, you know, if you were a certain class, you couldn't wear certain clothing. But my question is about the way that either tapestries that were made that people may not have seen, the common people or the merchant class may not have seen the artwork, but they would have seen the clothes. And how did that transfer down to, you know, someone who wanted to dress for a party or whatever? Did those fashions filter down?
I love that question. One of the great things for us, I think, studying 16th century English art and court practice is this is really the period when written chronicles become incredibly popular, and there are multiple chronicles which were published throughout the Tudors' reign describing court spectacles, particularly important ceremonies, christenings, baptisms, weddings, coronations. And one thing that these chroniclers concentrate on time and time again is the use of sumptuous textiles during the processions from the royal palaces to locations like Westminster Abbey, describing the cloth of gold used in the canopies, the horses' clothes, the chargers' cloths, the way they would even use semi-precious textiles to lay on a pathway for the royals to walk upon, and cheaper textiles which by the end of the processions the populace would have ripped to shreds to have sort of secular relics of experiencing those occasions. And so certainly, especially if you were a Londoner, you would have had a chance to have seen a lot of the Italian velvets and so forth in that court context. And also, as Adam mentioned, there's this whole army of servants, of people active in the court context who were also witnessing this, emulating it, sharing it, and taking these examples abroad. So I would say certainly there is that aspect of experience. Also, you'll see in the exhibition, we do also have some great examples of prints which were being made during the period and disseminated then broadly amongst the populace. And certainly, therefore, although there were sumptuary laws, Henry VII is the first to bring them in. Henry VIII really reiterates them, limiting the wearing of cloth of gold to the royal family in their very close circle. You see emulation of those types of patterns, of those types of works, even if they're not with those incredible raw materials. And again, the local craft, the English craft of needlework was one segue into imitating those lovely court effects on a much cheaper level.
And I'll just add that this was also the golden age of English theater, and scholars have shown that there was a major trade in secondhand clothes where noble households would sell clothes that were from last season to the theater, and then they would appear on the actors in Shakespeare's plays. So that's another way that people would have really seen these clothes.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. Were any of the objects in the exhibition conserved specifically or because of the exhibition? Did that?
Yeah, I could jump in there. Thank you for that question, because indeed, also pertaining to the earlier question, you have to walk a fine tightrope. You want to share these treasures with as many people as possible, but at the same time, loving and treasuring these treasures. You don't want to risk their well-being, their physical well-being. But certainly, one of the great advantages of being able to do a project like this is having the ability then to set in motion conservation campaigns for the works. So, for example, in terms of the textiles, the wonderful creation tapestry, which is that one which was part of the set acquired by Henry VII, which you can see upstairs, lent from Narbonne Cathedral, was conserved specially for the exhibition. As I said, or maybe I didn't, but it's been in Narbonne for the last 400 odd years. It was also sold at those Commonwealth sales in 1649 and arrives in Narbonne very soon afterwards. And it had to be gently conserved, really just to make sure that it was in a condition to responsibly be transported across the Atlantic and put on show for visitors. Another textile we conserved was the velvet cloth of gold from the Met's own collection. The Met received that in a generous bequest in 1964, and I don't believe it had ever actually been out on display, in part because it is so large. It's a challenge how to responsibly display a work like that. That was my fantastic textile conservation colleagues at the Met, in particular Giulia Kilstrini, who did a year-long conservation, stabilization, consolidation project on that velvet to make it fit to display.
I also just want to highlight a conservation project that was done here in San Francisco that is a wonderful portrait of Frances Walsingham that underwent a fascinating treatment and confirmed her identity. And it's really a marvelous piece of detective work conducted by Elise Elfland, who's joined us today. So please make sure that you see that portrait as well.
And we conserved some of the paneling which had been in storage since 1985 from the Fine Arts Museum's collections from Borton Place, and that's also included in the show. So there are many different aspects of the objects in the show that did undergo some measure of conservation. Well, if there are no more questions, then I think it would be good for me to thank Adam and Lizzie for coming from New York.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And to thank the Team Tudor in the Fine Arts Museums. Thomas Wu wrote a lot of the introductory text that you see on the walls. Isabella Holland did a lot of the research for the loans. Monique Abadilla from registration really pulled the many loans together. Our design team was fantastic. The exhibition team was great. And Elise, who is here, did some terrific work on painting. So it's a collaborative effort. And I'm very grateful to all our colleagues for their enthusiasm and their efforts to make this exhibition really shine. So thank you for coming today.